She didn't start a war. She was built to end one. Not the war between Troy and Greece, the war between a species that had grown too heavy for its own planet and the intelligence that designed the scales. Most people know the name Helen of Troy. They picture a beautiful woman standing on a balcony, a face that launched 1,000 ships, a love story gone catastrophically wrong. They have been told a fairy tale. What Homer actually wrote, if you strip away 3,000 years of romantic mythology and read the source material with clinical precision, is something far darker. What Homer actually wrote is a weapons manual. The entity called Helen of Sparta was not born, she was manufactured. Her existence was not an accident of desire. It was the calculated output of a systemic culling protocol initiated by the apex intelligence of the ancient Greek universe. And she executed her function with a perfection that no sword, no army, and no plague could have matched. Before this is over, you will understand exactly how. But first, you need to understand what she actually was. Because the answer begins not with a woman, but with an egg. In the ancient tradition preserved in the Cypria, the fragmentary text that forms the prologue to Homer's entire war cycle, Zeus is confronted with a problem of cosmic logistics. The earth itself is suffering under what the Greeks called akthos aurores, a phrase that translates with clinical precision as the oppressive weight of human overpopulation. The earth is groaning under the sheer mass of accumulated human civilization, its warlords and kings and armies burning through its resources, breeding without restraint, their combined weight becoming an existential threat to the system's stability. Zeus does not pray. He does not mourn. He drafts a solution. The Greeks called his decision the Dios Boule, the will of Zeus. Scholars translate it as a divine plan. What it actually was, read without sentimentality, was a targeted extinction protocol. Zeus identified the specific demographic causing the imbalance, the warlord class, the cognitive and martial elite of the entire civilized world, and he engineered a mechanism to lure them all into a single geographic location and eliminate them simultaneously. The mechanism he engineered was Helen. To build her, he did not use conventional biology. He assumed the form of a swan, the apex predator of the avian world, and he targeted a woman named Nemesis, the goddess of inescapable retribution, who fled across land and sea, transforming through every animal shape available to her until, desperate and cornered, she took the form of a goose and was overtaken. In the alternate tradition preserved by Apollodorus, the target was Leda, a mortal queen of Sparta. In both lineages, the result is identical. Helen is not born. She hatches from an egg. The Greek word is oion. She emerges from a calcified shell, an avian hominid hybrid, a literal cuckoo placed in the nest of human civilization, carrying the genetic architecture of the cosmos's most dangerous predator, encoded inside the most aesthetically perfect body the human species had ever been forced to perceive. The Roman mythographer Fulgentius observed that the egg retained what he described as all the contamination that is washed away at birth, a seedbed of scandal and strife. He was being poetic. What he was clinically describing was a payload delivery system. The shell was not a metaphor. It was the containment vessel for something that would, once hatched, operate with the unstoppable, directionless efficiency of a biological agent released into an unprotected population. There is a concept in ethology, the study of animal behavior, that a researcher named Nicholas Tinbergen first identified in the mid-20th century. He called it the supernormal stimulus. The principle is breathtaking in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. When an organism evolves a behavioral response to a natural trigger, an exaggerated artificial version of that trigger will produce a more powerful response than the real thing. Tinbergen demonstrated this by presenting an oyster catcher bird with an enormous plaster egg painted with exaggerated markings, placed next to its own biological egg. The bird abandoned its real egg, the egg containing its own genetic future, and attempted to incubate the fake one. Because the fake one triggered its hardwired instincts at a higher intensity than reality ever could. The bird's survival programming was not just overridden, it was weaponized against itself. Helen of Sparta was that plaster egg. She possessed what we would now describe as an artificially elevated concentration of every biological fitness indicator that the male visual cortex evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to detect and respond to. Facial symmetry, the precise geometric ratios that signal developmental health, the physiological cues of extraordinary reproductive viability, all compressed and amplified beyond anything that occurs in natural human variation. When men looked at her, they were not looking at a human female. Their brains were registering a supernormal stimulus, a signal so far above the evolutionary threshold that it did not merely attract, it hijacked. It shut down the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for threat assessment, long-term planning, and the cost-benefit analysis of survival. It flooded the mesolimbic dopamine system, the brain's reward circuitry, with a signal so intense that it overrode everything else, including the instinct to survive. The men who encountered Helen did not fall in love with her. They fell into her. The distinction is critical. Love is a voluntary surrender. What happened to the men around Helen was involuntary systemic failure, and the most terrifying demonstration of that failure was still decades away. But to understand what she would eventually do, you first need to understand the containment protocol that failed to stop her. Because someone understood exactly what she was, and he tried to build a trap around the trap. His name was Odysseus, and even he could not have predicted how thoroughly his own solution would detonate. Odysseus was the smartest man in Greece. Every ancient source agrees on this without reservation. He was a tactician, a linguist, a manipulator, a strategist of the first order. When the suitors descended on Sparta to compete for Helen's hand, Odysseus arrived and immediately understood the situation with the cold precision of a bomb disposal technician staring at a device he has never seen before. He did not compete for her. He watched, calculated, and proposed a solution. What the gathering of suitors in Sparta actually was, beneath the ceremonial veneer of courtship, was one of the most volatile geopolitical standoffs the ancient Greek world had ever produced. Ajax was there, Diomedes was there, Idomeneus, Menelaus, every significant warlord on the peninsula, each arriving with heavily armed retinues, their gift-giving functioning as thinly veiled displays of military logistics, each one capable of annihilating Sparta if denied. King Tyndareus, Helen's mortal surrogate father, was trapped in a problem with no clean solution. Award Helen to any single warlord, and every other warlord becomes an immediate existential threat. The biological weapon in his house had already, by her mere existence, created the conditions for the total military destruction of his own city. Odysseus saw the trap. He also saw the only possible escape from it, and that escape was itself a trap, just a larger one. His solution was the oath of Tyndareus. Before any suitor was permitted to compete for Helen, every man present was forced to swear a binding oath that whichever man won her, all others would come to his military defense if anyone ever attempted to take her away. The oath was sealed with a ritual that modern sensibilities instinctively want to sanitize, but which the ancient sources describe in deliberate, clinical detail. According to the geographer Pausanias and later mythographic tradition, Tyndareus sacrificed a horse, and the warlords were made to physically stand upon the severed organs of the animal while swearing. The Greek term for those pieces is tomia, which means, precisely, cut things. The ritual forced each man to stand in the blood, to feel the weight of severed biology under his feet, and to understand that breaking this oath meant exactly the same fate for his own bloodline. It was a blood curse dressed as a diplomatic protocol. What Odysseus had engineered was the Bronze Age equivalent of mutually assured destruction. The principle is identical to the nuclear deterrence doctrine that governed 20th century geopolitics for 5 decades. The guarantee of absolute, disproportionate retaliation makes initiating conflict so catastrophically expensive that no rational actor will attempt it. Helen would be awarded to Menelaus. Every other warlord would go home. And if anyone, ever, attempted to acquire the biological weapon by force, they would trigger the full military might of the entire Greek world, descending on them simultaneously. The weapon would be contained. The equilibrium would hold. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction relies on one foundational assumption: that all actors in the system are rational, that self-preservation overrides appetite, that the fear of annihilation is louder than the voice of compulsion. This assumption is not wrong. It is nearly always correct. Cold wars stay cold precisely because the actors involved are capable of calculating their own deaths and choosing not to die. The oath of Tyndareus failed for the same reason all perfectly designed containment systems eventually fail. Not because the system was wrong, because it encountered a variable it was not designed to account for. His name was Paris. He was a Trojan prince who arrived in Sparta as a diplomatic guest, a position that carried the full protection of the ancient sacred law of Xenia, the bond of hospitality between host and visitor. He arrived, ate Menelaus's food, slept under his roof, and departed in his absence with the biological weapon in tow, along with a significant portion of the royal treasury. In almost every analysis of the Trojan War, this act is framed as an impulsive romantic choice, a young man recklessly following desire. But the Cypria and the mythographic tradition are explicit about what actually drove him. Paris had been offered a judgment by 3 goddesses, and he chose the one who offered him the most beautiful woman in the world. He was operating under divine compulsion. His rational self-preservation instinct had been overridden by the same mechanism that would override every other man who came into range of the anomaly. He was not a romantic. He was a field test. And the test confirmed that the supernormal stimulus was fully operational, capable of defeating even the sacred protections of Xenia, even the threat of civilizational annihilation, even the explicit knowledge that taking this woman meant triggering every warlord on the planet. The oath of Tyndareus detonated exactly as designed. The entire Greek world mobilized. 1,000 ships were assembled at Aulis. The greatest concentration of military talent in the Bronze Age formed a coalition force and set sail for a city none of them had any rational interest in destroying. The Containment Protocol had not stopped the weapon. It had transformed it. What had been a passive supernormal stimulus, dangerous only to those in direct proximity, was now a detonator for a continental war. The most clever geopolitical architecture the ancient Greek world had ever produced had been threaded through the biological weapon, and was now being used by the weapon to drag the entire Greek military elite to its own destruction. Odysseus had tried to cage the fire. Instead, he had given it a fuse. But here is the part that history never discusses. The part that lives beneath the surface of every epic poem and tragic drama about the Trojan War. Helen, at the moment Paris came to collect her, was not a willing passenger. She said no. This is the fact that the tradition of the beautiful, faithless temptress has spent 3,000 years trying to bury, and Homer refuses to let it stay buried. He writes it directly. He writes it in scene. He does not imply it or obscure it. He stages it in close detail in Book 3 of the Iliad, and if you read the Greek without the softening lens of romantic convention, what you are reading is a scene of absolute, psychological horror. Paris has just been humiliated in single combat with Menelaus. The man who triggered a 10-year war rather than live without Helen has, when actually confronted with Helen's husband on a battlefield, nearly died within minutes and been physically rescued by divine intervention. He is back in his bedchamber in Troy, essentially hiding. Aphrodite, who championed Paris from the beginning because his judgment awarded her the prize of the golden apple, now appears to Helen on the walls of Troy. Helen does not see a glowing goddess. She sees a disguised old woman, and she recognizes the disguise. She knows who it is. She knows what is being asked of her. She refuses. She calls Aphrodite's request obscene. She mocks it. She suggests, with the biting precision of someone who has spent a decade watching her own face destroy the world, that if the goddess loves Paris so much, she should abandon Olympus and go sleep with him herself. These are not the words of a woman who ran away for love. These are the words of a prisoner who has run out of patience with her captor. Aphrodite's response is the most clinically terrifying moment in the entire Iliad. The goddess drops the disguise and the pretense simultaneously. She tells Helen that she can choose to defy her, and then she describes, in precise and methodical terms, exactly what she will do if Helen makes that choice. She will transfer the absolute hate of both sides of the war onto Helen's person. She will ensure that when Troy falls, and it will fall, Helen dies in the rubble in a way that will satisfy nobody and protect nothing. Helen submits. Homer uses a specific word for her emotional state in that moment. Edison. She went in terror. Not in love, not in longing. In terror. She wrapped herself in her white linen veil, pulling it tight around her body. And Homer's clinical scholars note that this gesture is not seductive. It is protective. It is the defensive flinching of a person attempting to make themselves smaller, attempting to shield the body from an inescapable violation. The Greek philosophical tradition understood precisely what this scene was. The sophist Gorgias, writing his Encomium of Helen in the 5th century before the Common Era, builds the central argument of his defense on this exact principle. If Helen acted under divine compulsion, under the force of a power that is by definition larger than a human prefrontal cortex, then she bears the same moral responsibility as a person dragged somewhere by a chain. Ananke, absolute compulsion, is the philosophical concept that names what was being done to her. It is the force that cannot be reasoned with, argued against, or outlasted. Gorgias compares it explicitly to the effect of drugs on the body. The mind does not choose to submit to a narcotic. The narcotic simply overrides the mind's preference. The Greek word for the mechanism Aphrodite used is thelkterion, the paralyzing charm. Not a metaphor, a specific technical term for a force that binds the mind, that colonizes the neural pathways and issues commands the host cannot refuse. And the Greek word for the ruinous consequence of that infection is ate, the divine madness that seizes a person and drives them toward catastrophic, unavoidable destruction. Helen is not the source of ate. She is its vector. Aphrodite is the programmer. Helen is the code being executed. Here is the observation that no ancient source makes explicit, but that the evidence demands. There is a pattern in the history of biological systems that matches the function being described with uncanny precision. A parasite that colonizes a host organism does not harm the host immediately. That would be counterproductive. It modifies the host's behavior in ways that maximize the parasite's own dispersal and reproduction, even as those behaviors lead to the host's eventual death. The lancet liver fluke infects ants and compels them to climb to the top of grass blades, where they are eaten by grazing animals, completing the parasite's life cycle at the direct expense of the ant's survival. The host organism's own nervous system is hijacked and turned against the host's interests. The ant does not want to climb the grass blade. The fluke does not care what the ant wants. Aphrodite, read through this lens, is not a goddess of love. She is the algorithmic expression of the blind genetic drive for reproduction and dispersal, operating with total indifference to the consciousness of the organism she has colonized. Helen's guilt, her self-loathing, her explicit awareness of the destruction she is catalyzing, these are all real and documented in Homer. None of them are relevant to the function being performed. The biological weapon had been deployed, the fuse had been lit, and the weapon was going to Troy, whether it wanted to or not. But the most terrifying demonstration of what Helen actually was had not yet happened. That demonstration would occur not in a bedchamber, not on a battlefield, but on a wall, in full daylight, in front of the men whose sons were dying in the mud 300 meters below. 10 years, 1,000 ships, hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The most fortified city in the ancient world, surrounded and slowly strangled across a decade of attritional warfare. Men dying by the thousand every season, from bronze, from disease, from the slow accumulation of trauma that we now have the clinical vocabulary to call post-traumatic stress disorder, though the Greeks simply called it the weight of the dead. Troy was burning at its edges. The Greek armada was fracturing under the pressure of a campaign that had already outlasted its original strategic logic. Everyone involved knew, on some level, that they were dying for something that could not be rationally defended. And then Homer places his camera on the walls of Troy. The Teichoscopia, the viewing from the walls, is one of the most analyzed passages in the entire Western literary tradition. King Priam sits at the Scaean Gate with the senior council of Troy, the elders of the city. These are not young soldiers inflamed with testosterone and ambition. These are old men, scholars, statesmen, advisors who have governed a city for decades. Their testosterone levels have, in biological terms, declined to the point where the acute disruption of judgment caused by sexual attraction should be functionally minimal. More importantly, these are men who have watched their sons, their grandsons, and their neighbors' sons die in the mud below those walls for 10 consecutive years. They understand, with the crystalline clarity of grief and long experience, exactly why that war is being fought. They know Helen is the reason. They are looking directly at the woman who has been burning their civilization to the ground since before most of those soldiers below were born. And when they see her, this is what they say. Homer renders their words with a precision that reads, in the original Greek, less like poetry and more like a field report. They murmur to one another that no one can blame the men of Troy and Greece for suffering years of agony for this woman. They use the phrase, ou nemesis, not a cause for righteous indignation. This is not a casual compliment. Nemesis is the Greek concept of divine moral retribution, the anger of the universe at violations of the natural order. By saying ou nemesis, the elders are formally concluding that civilizational collapse, the slaughter of a generation, the burning of their own city, these things do not constitute a violation that demands moral correction. Because she is worth it. And then they describe her beauty not with words that mean lovely or radiant or pleasing. They use the word ainos, terrible, dreadful, the word reserved for the overwhelming, visceral dread inspired by the divine, the monstrous, and the incomprehensible. They recognize, on a primal register that bypasses language, that they are not looking at a human being. They describe her as being terrifyingly like the immortal goddesses to look upon. They are identifying, with the instinctive accuracy of old men who have seen everything, that they are in the presence of an apex predator operating in a form their nervous systems were not designed to classify as a threat. This is the scene that the text has been building toward since the first fragment of the Cypria. This is the proof of concept. This is the biological weapon demonstrating its fullest operational capacity. Because what is being described is not desire. What is being described is the total collapse of the human brain's most fundamental survival architecture in men who should, by every biological and psychological metric, be immune to it. The prefrontal cortex is the region of the brain responsible for rational decision-making, threat assessment, and the suppression of immediate impulses in favor of long-term survival. Evolutionary psychology is clear that its function is not optional. It is the cognitive infrastructure on which the survival of individuals, families, and civilizations depends. Helen's aesthetic perfection, the accumulated divine engineering of a supernormal stimulus designed specifically to defeat human male cognitive function, does not merely overwhelm the prefrontal cortex. It performs what engineers, thinking about electromagnetic systems, call a localized pulse, a targeted burst of energy that does not destroy the system outright, but temporarily renders it non-functional. The elders cannot process the data of their burning city. Their neurocomputational bandwidth has been entirely requisitioned. They are staring at mathematical certainty of their own extinction, and their hacked brains are forcing them to find it beautiful. There is no sword that does this. There is no army that does this. There is no plague, no famine, no siege engine that walks into a room and causes the cognitive elite of an entire civilization to conclude in real time, while watching their sons die, that it is all fine. It is all acceptable. None of this warrants moral outrage, because the thing that caused it is too beautiful to condemn. This is what a biological weapon of extinction actually looks like. Not chaos, not fire, just a woman standing on a wall, and the silence of old men who have forgotten how to object. But Troy falls. The weapon survives. And what happens after the war ends is, in some ways, the most disturbing evidence of all. The war ends the way wars of attrition always end, not with glory, but with exhaustion. Troy burns. Its men are killed. Its women are distributed among the Greek commanders like livestock. The armada that assembled to recover the biological weapon is then largely destroyed on the voyage home, picked apart by storms and betrayals, and the long-deferred consequences of a decade of behavior the gods have been watching with accumulating displeasure. The human cost, measured in bodies, in burned cities, in the specific grief of women who will never see their sons again, is generational, a demographic wound, a civilization reduced. And then Homer shows us the epilogue. 10 years after the war is ended, in Book 4 of the Odyssey, Odysseus' son Telemachus travels to Sparta. He finds Menelaus, the man who triggered continental war to recover his wife, sitting in his palace in the middle of a banquet, and sitting beside him, apparently unbothered, apparently comfortable, apparently settled back into the rhythms of domestic queenship, as though the preceding 20 years were a mild inconvenience, is Helen. Menelaus begins to weep at dinner. The memories are too close. Telemachus weeps alongside him. The men in the room are dissolving under the weight of what they survived, their bodies betraying them in the way that happens to people whose nervous systems were exposed to prolonged extreme violence and never given the space to process it. This is post-traumatic stress disorder rendered in clinical detail 3,000 years before the diagnostic manual existed to name it. Helen watches this happen with the calm, assessing gaze of a clinician evaluating a patient's vital signs. Then she rises, crosses to where the wine is being prepared, and adds something to it. Something she acquired in Egypt from a woman named Polydamna during the years she spent there. The substance is called Nepenthe, and Homer describes its pharmacological profile with a precision that reads less like mythological imagination and more like a physician's notes. Whoever drinks it will not shed a tear that day, regardless of what happens. Not if their mother and father die in front of them. Not if a brother or beloved child is killed before their eyes. The grief circuits are simply offline. The emotional processing apparatus is temporarily suspended. The men drink, and their eyes go flat, and the crying stops, and there is only the hollow, medicated calm of people whose central nervous systems have been chemically intervened upon without their informed consent. Modern classical pharmacologists examining this passage identify Nepenthe not as a magical potion, but as a real substance. Most likely an opium-based formulation, possibly enhanced with cannabis or mandrake, consistent with what Egyptian medical knowledge of that period was actually capable of producing. The Egyptians understood soporifics and analgesics with a sophistication that the Greek world largely borrowed. The effects Homer describes, the emotional blunting, the grief suppression, the ability to witness acute violence without emotional response, these are the textbook effects of a concentrated opiate administered in sufficient dose. Helen was already in possession of a controlled pharmaceutical strong enough to chemically lobotomize apex warriors, and she had been carrying it since her time in Egypt. And she deployed it smoothly, at a dinner party, on her own husband and a grieving boy she had just met, with no visible hesitation and no explanation offered until after the wine was already inside them. She shares the epithet polypharmakos, skilled in many drugs, with her aunt Circe, who used pharmaceuticals to transform men into swine. The difference in method is clinical. Circe transforms, Helen pacifies. Circe makes the change visible. Helen leaves the man in the same chair with the same face, making the same sounds, while everything that made him capable of objection has been quietly removed. This is the final revelation of what the biological weapon is for. The Dios Boule has been executed. The culling is complete. A generation of warlords has been fed into the machine and processed. What remains is the post-extinction landscape, the depopulated world of broken men who survived but cannot carry the weight of what they witnessed. Helen's last function is not to destroy them, it is to manage them, to maintain the host environment, to keep the surviving population docile, compliant, and chemically incapable of the rage that would, if left unmedicated, eventually turn toward the obvious question: why are all my friends dead, and why are you sitting there looking exactly the same as you did 20 years ago? The algorithm executed flawlessly. Millions lie in the mud. Cities have burned on 2 continents. The greatest concentration of military talent the Bronze Age ever produced has been systematically fed into a machine that ground them to ash across a decade. And at the center of the rubble, unaging and unbothered, the biological weapon sits in its marble palace, dripping dark Egyptian resin into a cup of red wine, and waits. The Dios Boule is complete. And here is the deepest irony embedded in every layer of this story, the one that reframes everything you just watched. The weapon that destroyed a generation was not Aphrodite. It was not Zeus. It was not Paris or Menelaus or the accumulated ego of the Greek warlord class. The weapon that destroyed them was the thing they had spent their entire civilization building: the capacity to recognize and pursue the most perfect possible version of what they valued. They were destroyed not by their weakness, but by the full, unobstructed operation of their greatest strength. The same cognitive machinery that made them the finest warriors, tacticians, and kings of their age, the hardwired drive toward the best available option, was turned against them at full power. Their excellence became the vector. Their strength became the kill shot. Which means the question is not why Helen destroyed them. The question is whether you would have done any differently. Not whether you would have gone to war. Whether, standing on the wall of your burning city, watching everything you built collapse in real time. You would have been able to look at the thing that caused it and call it wrong instead of beautiful. Because the force that made those elders say Nemesis is not a Bronze Age failure, it is not a mythological artifact, you know exactly what it feels like. It is the thing you keep returning to that you know is not good for you. It is the project you cannot stop working on, even as it costs you every relationship you have. It is the person you cannot stop defending, even as the evidence mounts. It is whatever your own supernormal stimulus is, the specific frequency of beauty or meaning or purpose that your nervous system was calibrated to respond to long before your prefrontal cortex had a vote, and that can, under the right conditions, override the rational architecture you have spent your whole life constructing. So here is the question, and there is no clean answer, only a fault line that runs directly through you. If you had been standing on that wall with Priam's elders, if you had watched a decade of your own destruction and then turned and seen Helen of Troy in the full operational force of what she was, would you have been the one to say that this, finally, was the thing worth condemning? Or would you have looked at the mathematical certainty of your own extinction and found it, like every one of them did, terrifyingly, perfectly, undeniably beautiful? But Helen is not finished with you, because there is a woman whose story intersects with hers in a way that the tradition has never fully examined. A figure who operated on similar principles, deployed similar tools, and arrived at an ending so different from Helen's that it demands a complete re-examination of what divine favor actually costs. Her name is Circe. She is Helen's aunt. She is a witch, a pharmacologist, and a transformer of men. And the story of what she did with her power, and what it ultimately did to her, is a far more uncomfortable mirror than anything you have encountered here. You have already been pulled into it. You just don't know it yet.